costly or risky. And I suppose what you can do is go, oh, they're stupid. Okay. I guess if I call you stupid, that makes me so smart because I can denigrate you. Explains nothing. So rather than do that, they're very intelligent men. And why are they doing things? Why do they consider their actions rational, and rational in what context? So this is what I'm going to be up to. And I can start with a little story to illustrate my point. In the summer of 1943, this is after the battles of the Solomons, New Guinea, Guadalcanal, they're all over with. The Imperial Japanese Army had a war college. An instructor comes into class one day, and he says, from now on, the curriculum's changed. The main emphasis is going to be countering U.S. tactics instead of what they had been teaching was Soviet tactics. And we'll become the A course. And if anyone can teach this, go ahead, because I don't know a damn thing about it. Talk about being unprepared for seminar. And then think about it. Where are the Japanese actually fighting most of the time? What is the country that most matters to them at the end of the day? It would be China. And that's not what their war colleges are studying. Something's up here. Now, they're clearly making a really bad net assessment about the United States. Okay, this country also is known for lousy net assessments. I don't believe ours about Vietnam was particularly good either. And that's one part of the problem. So here's my game plan for this evening. I'm first going to talk about traditional Japanese theorists. And then it's going to be talking about Japanese practice. If you have this belief system, how explanatory is it for practice? This is my game plan right now. So the Japanese don't have just the one book like Sun Tzu's The Art of War or Clausewitz's On War. What they have is Bushido, Code of the Samurai. It's a whole literature, and it was written in the Tokugawa period, which quite ironically was a period known for peace, not warfare. Never mind. And what's interesting about this literature from a Western perspective, it's really not about military strategy. It's about deportment. It's how a samurai should conduct himself. And this reflects Japanese values and what the things that they emphasize. And so I'm going to go through it with you. Here's the game plan on the theorists. First, I'm going to talk about the philosophical origins of Bushido, then the values that underpin it, and then the operational preferences that grow out of it. That's the game plan for first half. And I'm going to use as my cultural bridge this man, Nitobe Inazo, who wrote a book much later in 1900, Bushido, Soul of Japan, Why Am I Doing This? He provides a concise definition of Bushido. And you can see he's an important figure in Japan. Not everybody gets their mug on the 5,000 yen note. So he's an important figure in Japan. He had spent 18 years abroad, and he had received higher education in Japan and a variety of Western institutions. He married, believe it or not, I don't make up these things, a Philadelphia Quaker, and he converted to Christianity. And he spent his life trying to serve as a cultural bridge, and that's how I'm going to use him today. And what he said is, unlike in the West, where notions of morality come from religion, in Japan they come from Bushido. And what is it? It's a chivalrous code of honor for the warrior class, these precepts of knighthood. There are three pillars of Bushido, according to Nitobe. They're Buddhism, Shinto, and Confucianism. From Buddhism is where you see Japanese fatalism, the origin of it. And here you have Nitobe saying, it's this calm trust in fate, a quiet submission to the inevitable, a friendliness with death. And it strikes Westerners reading this Bushido literature as a preoccupation with death. For instance, Clausewitz will talk about violence in warfare, but he's not interested in what constitutes an honorable death, let alone choreographing a soldier's final moments. Different culture. And from Buddhism, there are four noble truths of Buddhism. One is that existence is suffering, pessimistic view of this life. Second, it's caused by craving and attachment, so don't cling to this life or the things in it. It's all ephemeral. It's like a cherry blossom, blooms for a day and then it's gone. But there's a a good ending to it all, which is nirvana. And how do you get there? The fourth noble truth is through forms of right conduct. So the emphasis isn't on what you achieve in your life. It's how you lead it. It's this focus on deportment. It's different from the West. Second pillar is Shinto, is this extreme patriotism, reverence for the emperor. And the third pillar is Confucianism, these imported ideas from China. Confucianism is at heart of how it's organizing a society and regulating it through interlocking social obligations, hierarchical, and through ritual and etiquette. So in the West, there's much talk about equality, right? And in the West, in the East, it's duty. It's what you owe other people. In the East, there is no such thing as social in China, in Japan of equality. Even twins have a birth order, and it's not about freedom either. It's about what you owe others. So if you think that these value system seems really different, yeah, no kidding. It has nothing to do with the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian West. Completely different value system. And so, Alice, welcome to Wonderland. Buckle up. We're off for a ride. And I'm going to start. Here's my first piece of the Tokugawa literature. Yamamoto Tsunetomo's The Hagakure that he wrote in the early 18th century. It translates variously as hidden leaves, hidden by the leaves. And in it, he is describing, I'm going to read you some short passages from it all. What was he? He was a retainer for a daimyo, a feudal lord in Japan. He hadn't actually done any fighting, even though he's writing all about it. So if you don't do, what do? You publish. And I will tell you what the man had to say. So here we go. One of the first things is this preoccupation with death. And here's Yamamoto. The way of the samurai is imagining the most sightly way of dying. Merit lies more in dying for one's master than in striking down the enemy. The way of the samurai is found in death. It is not necessary to gain one's aim, but if you live on without achieving it, it's cowardice. However, if you don't gain your aim and die, that's okay. This is really different from Clausewitz, where it's all about achieving the policy objective. It's not about how the soldier's leading his life. And here you can see the consequences of this, right? If you're focusing on no fears of death, and if you can't succeed, living on is a disaster. Think of the Banzai charges, when Japanese remnants would go headlong into oncoming machine gun fire, knowing full well what was going to happen. This is not the way other armies have behaved. Different value system. All right. In addition to at death, this Bushido literature's emphasis on honor, back to Yamamoto. The way of avoiding shame is different. It's simply death, even if it seems certain that you will lose, retaliate. Think of General Tojo and Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku. Now, and if you suffer a catastrophic defeat, here's the solution. In the event of a mortifying failure, you're going to wind up committing suicide, because the alternative, if you live on in shame, you're bringing everyone you're associated with shame. And I'm going to use Nitobe to be the cultural bridge. He said, in our minds, this mode of death is associated with the instances of noblest deeds and most touching pathos. So this vilest form of death assumes a sublimity and becomes a symbol of new life. It's a way to escape from disgrace. And in Japanese literature, there is the tragic hero who is pursuing noble but unattainable aims, and rather than making disagreeable compromises, goes down in flames. This is what seppuku is all about. And Nitobe is saying, look, death involving a question of honor was accepted in Bushido as a key solution to many complex problems. And you can think in World War II, yeah, it was. Complex problems like battle plans not working out and a war that was truly not working out. All right. So in addition to death and suicide and honor, we've got loyalty. It's another key value. And back to Yamamoto. Being a good retainer is nothing other than being a supporter of one's lord. A man is a good retainer to the extent that he earnestly places importance in his master, Having only wisdom and talent is the lowest tier of usefulness. So much for Silicon Valley. For a warrior, there is nothing other than thinking of his master. And so back in the day, it's thinking of your feudal lord. In more recent times, it's prioritizing your company over family. In China, it's the reverse priority. It's family over company. And it's different cultures, different priorities. All right, there are strategic implications. If this is your value system, this is what arises from it. First of all, you're looking at damage limitation, damage control, not in terms of the physical cost of losing lives, having property blown up, but in terms of honor. Also, there's a tendency to equate operational with strategic success. Operational success is, I win this battle here and now. Strategic success is, okay, we're in a war for some reason. What is the reason you're in the war? Japan's reasons for being in China had to do with containing communist expansion and also stabilizing the place so they could make money out of business. So that's your strategic objective. It's not your operational one. But the Japanese samurai are equating the two, saying if I take this hill, somehow it's automatically going to deliver the strategic objective. And in fact, they won most of the battles in China, but they lost that war. Also, there's this focus on what constitutes an honorable death. It's not the Western focus of literature is all about preparing the field of battle in advance for success, and whereas this literature is focusing on what to do after disaster. So that, here are some more implications. Once the Japanese are failing in battle, operational failure, they are on death ground. What does that mean? It means that death ground means the only way you survive is if you fight harder. Like this is what's going on in Ukraine right now, is that when you decide you're going to annihilate an entire culture, you put people on death ground and then they have very few choices on what they do next. That one means for the Japanese to feel that they're on death ground when they're failing means they're not going to give up. They're going to fight brutally against overwhelming odds. So in the West, when we like to mirror image, we want to think of the rational actor with some kind of mathematically based cost benefit of when you should give up, when the costs are so high above whatever your value of the object is, you ought to call it quits. Well, that kind of calculation does not translate well across the divides between civilizations. I've got a nice picture here of Lieutenant Onoda, who had been hanging out in Philippine jungles for 30 years after the end of the war, carrying on the war in isolation. I don't believe this is how most other armies work or soldiers in them. Different culture, different things you do with your life. And here is Sir William Slim, Field Marshal, British 14th Army that he led in Burma, commenting on his experiences. If 500 Japanese were ordered to hold a position, we had to kill 495, the last 5 committed suicide before we could take the place. And it was this combination of obedience and ferocity that made the Japanese so formidable. Okay, this brings me to another value that's emphasized in Bushido, willpower, back to Yamamoto. There is nothing that cannot be done. The way of the samurai is in desperateness. Simply become insane and desperate, and it'll somehow work out for you. And one can accomplish any feat. Think of Pearl Harbor. And this emphasis on willpower and just trying harder, it denigrates strategy. And here you see a picture of the supreme example of honor and loyalty and willpower in the Kamikaze pilots. But if this is what you're doing, you're denigrating strategy. And here Yamamoto's me talking about tactics, but it has operational and strategic implications. He says, learning such things as military tactics is useless. The way of the samurai is one of immediacy, and it is best to dash in headlong. If one were informed of military tactics, he would have many doubts. So the idea is, if you think about these things in peacetime, you'll start hesitating in wartime. It won't work out for you if you do this. During times of peace, when listening to the stories of battle, we should never say, in facing such a situation, what would a person do? Well, so much for my job at the Naval War College. So much for the case studies. No matter what the circumstances might be, one should be of the mind to win. One should be holding the first spear to strike. So here's the implications if you believe this. What you're doing, it's a very unanalytical way to approach wars. It's all about whatever it is you want, you just steal the will and go for it, and somehow you'll get it if you want. There's a lack of grand strategy. What's grand strategy? It's integrating all the instruments of national power, not just the army or the army and the navy, which is what the Japanese are trying to do, but all instruments of national power in pursuit of, if the bigger aim is to stabilize China and keep the communists out, there ought to be some diplomacy and some other things going on. But that's not what's happening. In the samurai literature, it's a focus on the military instrument exclusively. So I'll give you an example of how this works out. Before the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy invaded French Indochina, neither one of them did a little study saying, hey, if we do that, let's check the other side of the tennis court net and see what other people, how they might react. They just steal the will and march right in. Okay, that triggered the U.S. 100% oil embargo. That's a problem. Operational success, strategic mess. So it is this focusing on just the operational level is it's the basis for this ill-founded optimism with which the Japanese just took territory after territory without saying, hey, what about the cost of actually occupying these places? And, oh, we're going for these places for resources. So maybe we ought to check it out with the finance ministry and others about how are we ever going to get these resources back home? None of that's going on. It's a disaster for them. Okay, I'm going to talk about a couple of secondary theorists. One of them is Taira Shigesuke, who is a contemporary of Yamamoto, because he provides a really concise definition of the operative values of samurai culture. Only 3 things are considered essential: loyalty, duty, and valor. So steadfastly loyal in battle as to disregard his own life. What he's actually talking about is group loyalty. In the West, the basic unit composing society is the individual. Well, in the East, it's the group, and group interests take primacy over individual interests. And for the Japanese society is divided by in-groups and out-groups. The most basic in-group, biggest overarching one, is the Japanese people vis-a-vis everybody else. But within Japan, everybody comes from a different province, a different locality. They go to different educational institutes. They graduate from different kindergarten classes, I kid you not, and college classes. If they work for different companies or they work for or they're in the military, they're in different branches, and you also have family loyalties. And you owe each of these nested and overlapping groups different obligations. And sometimes these obligations conflict, and if the conflict's really awful, that's another reason for committing suicide. And then if you look at the Japanese language, the moment a person opens their mouth to speak to another Japanese, you can immediately listen to the grammatical forms that are being used, the specific word choices, to know what's the degree of hierarchy, like where do they sit in this unequal hierarchy, and whether it's in-group, out-group. So everybody feels, or most people feel, some level of group loyalty. This is human. But in Japan, it's the levels of membership are much more finely calibrated, and they're re-emphasized by these social, cultural, and linguistic reasons. So this group membership and stovepiping ultimately is going to be a much stronger feature of Japanese culture than some other places. All right. Last theorist is Miyamoto Musashi, who, unlike the other two, actually did a little fighting. He was born a little earlier, and he was a master samurai who taught people martial arts. And from him, you get a sense of some of the operational preferences deriving from these values. And I'm going to go through all of these in turn. First is risk intolerance, because remember at the beginning, I started with the 2 flag officers saying, well, we're going to do this war in the Pacific when it's unlikely we're going to succeed, but we're going to do it anyway. And here is Miyamoto. Furthermore, to fight even 5 or 10 people single-handedly in duels, that's what my military science is all about. So what's the difference between the logic of one person beating up 10 people and 1,000 people beating 10,000? logistics, my friend, but never mind. And then another thing that he emphasizes, in addition, don't expect long odds to deter the Japanese back in the day. Surprise is another one. Think about a situation that has stalemated and is going nowhere, which is what the China theater was for the Japanese. And how do you get out of it? And the answer that Miyamoto has is not come up with a new policy objective, but come up with a tactic that'll somehow put your enemy off balance and then get what you want that way. And the way the Japanese did this was often by opening a new theater in a war, by surprising people by the new places that you were going to start engaging in military operations. And here's how it worked. China had been a failed state since 1911. And it had had an escalating series of warlords fighting each other in this multilateral civil war. And the Japanese were appalled, particularly after the United States passed the Holy Smoot Tariff of 1930 that cut them off from international trade. So then they're thinking, now what? Well, we're going to need an empire big enough to survive since no one's going to trade with us. And so they invade all of Manchuria in 1931, and they have it pretty much stabilized by 1933. So, okay, that was surprise number one. But the rest of China is a mess. And the Japanese, it's coalescing into a bilateral communist nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, communists under Mao Zedong, fight with increasing dosages of Soviet aid. And the Japanese are appalled with all this. And so it's time to surprise everybody again in 1937. And that's when they invade all the way down the Chinese coast and up the Yangtze River. And it works. They take a lot of territory really fast, but then they get to the end of the railway system. Oh, and by the way, China's not pacified. It's just churning. And so now Japan is even more overextended. As a result of doing that, Russian aid goes up, and then you're going to get US aid in there. So the problem's actually getting worse. Okay, time for another surprise, really big one. On that infamous day in December 41, it wasn't just Pearl Harbor. That's Team America focusing only on Team America. The Japanese attacked all across the Pacific that day. Okay, now what? Here, China had never been able to threaten the Japanese home islands. Well, the United States. Here, the United States was totally isolationist. Most Americans couldn't find Japan on the map. Well, after Pearl Harbor, they sure could. And suddenly the United States isn't isolationist anymore, and they're coming to get the Japanese. So you can see the samurai values in operation here. Just try harder, more dosages of willpower. Eventually you'll win, or you'll die trying. Okay. Another operational preference that you can see, which is as part of the surprise or preemptive attacks. And that's just how Japan began all of its wars. The first Sino-Japanese War and the second Sino-Japanese War, Russo-Japanese War, and the Pacific War. This is how all of them began. And finally, Miyamoto offers some advice on how you break the enemy willpower. And in this case, you've already won conventionally, but they're waging an insurgency against you. I'm modernizing the terminology. And the idea is you want a psychological victory. You want them just to quit. And somehow you're going to break their will to resist. And I suspect this is what the Japanese thought they were doing in the rape of Nanjing and other atrocities, that they were going to do these horrifying things and that would break the will of the other side. Okay, be careful whom you put on death ground. The Japanese were repeating a mistake done by the Nazis, which is if you're dealing with even a failing state, which Russia was, Stalin had shot so many of his officers in the 30s, and then he'd inflicted a famine on Ukraine. But when the Nazis came in and they were going to wipe out not only the Russian government, but also the Russian people, you will superglue people, government, and military, and you will transform a failing state into a lethal adversary. And this is what Nazi brutality does to Russians, what Japanese brutality does to Chinese, and what Russian brutality today is doing to Ukraine. Don't do it. Bad strategy. All right. There are strategic implications from these values. One is this emphasis on the offensive, preemption. It's emphasis on military action to solve all your problems. And you have a fixed policy objective, whatever it is. And if you're in a given battle, you have to win that battle. It's not, oh, I have an overarching objective. It's too costly here. I'm going to call off this battle and I'm going to try again somewhere else. The moment your plan is failed, you're a failure. So they're not thinking of planning in terms of branches of sequels, and there'll be unexpected events that take place you'll adapt to. None of that. You're a failure if any of that stuff happens to you. So there's a real insensitivity to risk. And there's no grand strategy. But if you believe these things, you will be lethal in warfare. You're not going to give up easily at all. And so you look at the Japanese at the end of the war and go, why don't they quit a lot earlier? Well, it's because in a way, they're already dead men. They've suffered social death. And so they're going to keep on until the very, very end of all of this. And it's a great sin of omission, this absence of grand strategy. The Japanese aren't the only ones to have done this. The belligerents on all sides in World War I were thinking in terms of using the military instrument, got themselves into trouble. So if you look at what the Japanese are doing, they had some vague ambitions and wanted to take advantage of opportunities, but there's no definition of what win in this war is. How much territory should Japan take and then call it a day and say, done, we've been successful here. Rather, their territorial acquisitions are really a function of what they were able to take and what in anger they did take, but also a function of strategic failure. No matter what they did, it never pacified the China theater. Problem for them. Okay, Alice, that was Wonderland. Now we're going to get to how it works, how other people live, of if you believe these things, how does it help explain what actually happened in World War II? And I'm going to start with two sins of omission, the Japanese neglect of paying more careful consideration to logistics, and then another sin of omission is a neglect of protecting their sea lines of communication. And then the last two are about these in-group, out-group divisions and the problems it cause for within each military service, intra-service rivalries, and then between the two services, the Navy and the Army in the war, that cause them such difficulties. Okay, the Japanese, if you start at the beginning of the war, Japan never produced more than 1/113th U.S. steel and coal production. It never did more than 10% of what U.S. munitions productions were. I believe if you do the math and take all the battleships and divide people into everything, that each U.S. soldier had 4 tons of equipment per, whereas each Japanese soldier had about 2 pounds of equipment. Japanese main weapons in this war were the grenade and the bayonet. Their artillery and machine guns were very obsolete, what they had going in the Pacific War. And then you flip it around and look at the United States. The United States had about 18 men in supply, or men and women, but mostly men, in supply services supporting each rifleman at the front. Other militaries in this period had about an 8-to-1 ratio. Japan had about a 1-to-1. So Japan's already suffering food shortages before Pearl Harbor. And then when you get to the winter of 1942-43, the Japanese are having critical shortages of oil, so they no longer can deploy the fleet at will. That means you forget about convoying anything because you just haven't got the oil to do it. And yet, when you get to 45, when they're predicting they're going to have absolutely zero aviation fuel and other fuel by the end of 45, you have the government saying, still, we're going to fight on for this honorable whatever it's going to be. These Bushido ideas of that you just persevere, loyalty, honor, duty, keep going. All right, I'm going to be quoting this gentleman's diary, Admiral Ugaki Matome. He was the chief of the staff of the combined fleet until his plane and Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku's plane were shot down. U.S. code breaking was quite good. We figured out where they were, and we killed Admiral Yamamoto, but this man survived. And by the time he wrote this entry. He was the head of an air fleet on the home islands, sending kamikaze flights out because Japan simply lacked the ability to do too much else this late in the day. And here is his last diary entry written on August 15th, 1945. This is after 2 atomic bombs had been dropped and after the Russians had deployed into Manchuria. And he said, okay, there are various causes for today's tragedy, and I feel that my own responsibility is not light, but more fundamentally, it was due to the great differences in national resources between the two countries. Okay, it's too late to come to that conclusion. U.S. production statistics had been on the books forever, but when Japanese read these numbers, they thought they were ludicrously high and discounted them as propaganda. And those who knew better, who'd done tours of duty in Britain or the United States, they weren't promoted because they were defeatists. I believe that Admiral Ugaki kept and maintained his diary is because he was an honorable samurai. He had believed in Bushido, the ability of willpower to more than compensate for inferior resources, but the war's outcome had proved him incorrect. And so as an honorable samurai, he paid with his life, and he kept his diary to nothing to be ashamed of. He'd done what he was going to do. Here I have the last prime minister of Imperial Japan, Prince Higashikuni Narihiko, talking about his take on the war. He said, I think the basic cause of defeat was the loss of transport shipping. Okay. By the end of the war, Japan was down to 1/9 of its transport shipping. It meant the empire was paralyzed. What's the point of taking all these territories if you can't get the resources back? The Navy had always focused on the mission by Alfred Thayer Mahan, who's from where I work back in the day. It was all about fleet-on-fleet engagements and things. But it turns out that the Japanese Navy hadn't focused on convoy duty. Mahan had called that a promising secondary operation. Actually, it turned out to be primary in the Pacific, that U.S. submarine services paralyzed their sea lines of communication. Go submarines. But so here's Admiral Ugaki Matame, who is talking about, he eventually comes around to recommending a more defensive strategy of not having this fleet on fleet because they've lost a lot of the fleet and then they don't have the fuel to run it. But by the time he's recommending a more defensive strategy, they don't have the fuel or the assets to do that either. Earlier in the war, here's his take before all that bad stuff had happened. It's too bad for the officers and men of the submarine service that they have not yet sunk any important men of war, only merchantmen. Well, his disdain for the target would cost him. And he noted later on, when he's trying to account for why the Battle of Guadalcanal is going so badly for Japan, he said the aim of supply and transport to the front has not even been half fulfilled each time. It led those on the verge of death, i.e. the army, to be extremely skeptical about the Navy and thinking that the Navy is just sacrificing the Army. Well, no kidding, that's what the Army thought. Because for an expeditionary force, you absolutely need the Navy to deliver you there, to maintain your supplies there. And they're thinking, the Army's thinking, you Navy are being irresponsible, not doing any of these things. So there are tremendous inter-service rivalries between the Army and Navy in Japan. And it goes back to the pre-war budget wars, where Japan's a resource-poor country, and both services have what they consider absolutely essential things to be funded. Japan didn't have the money to fund both. And then when you get in war and you start expending these things, you need even more money. And so the disagreements were brutal. But before I get there, the in-group, out-group differences that stovepipe things and cause problems aren't simply between Army and Navy. They're within each service. So I'm going to start there. And to be fair, I'm going to provide one example for each service. I'll start with the Army. It was the Guangdong Army, or Japan's army in Manchuria, that decided to invade all of Manchuria back in 1931. It was not the home office back in Tokyo, but it's this branch that turns out kicks off a 15-year war. So these folks think that they know what's best for Japan and how best to defend the empire, and they're just off and running. Meanwhile, there are a series of coup attempts, some of them where Navy is part of it, a lot more of them with the Army that's dealing with it, going back and forth. And at the very end, when Emperor Hirohito is capitulating, there was one last coup attempt, which, amen, it failed, because the war might have terminated quite the way it did if it had succeeded. So the point is, if you got coups running on, that is not called unified command. It's a mess. And the Navy wasn't any better. I have a different sort of example here. During the war, the U.S. Air Service, the people who are flying planes, they would alternate combat and training missions so that you would bring back someone who had survived and learned something from combat to tell new people the things to avoid, how not to get yourself killed, and some other things. Well, in Japan, in groups, out groups, you sign up together, you train together, you fight together, and you die together. It doesn't mean the Japanese couldn't have grafted people between groups. It's just culturally, it's not the natural thing that comes to mind. Moreover, and this apparently applies to the present, that in the US military, they have what are called hot washes after different operations, where you come back and you're very self-critical about all the things that went wrong to figure out how to do it better the next time. Well, there are cultural reasons why you would not want to do that in Japan. It's different. So if these in-group, out-group things are causing problems within services, it gets toxic between the services. And I've got 4 examples, and I'm going to start with organizational issues. So it's only in 1944 that the Army and Navy finally get it together to have regular liaison meetings in Tokyo. Great. Just in time to figure out how the capitulation is going to work. And then the Army wanted to unify the 2 high commands. The Navy wanted nothing to do with that one because they knew they'd just become the box lunch delivery service for the Army, didn't want to do that. So by 1945, they did unify their information department. Great. They could spew the same propaganda and maybe share Tokyo Rose on a good day. Who knows? But there was no planning, even under the imminent threat of invasion, to how they're going to coordinate their assets to protect the home island. They aren't even coordinating their air assets. Disaster. And this disaster goes back way in time. They had very far back in time. They'd had a very successful war against Russia that ends in 1905. But afterwards, in 1906, immediately afterwards, the Army and Navy are allowed to have completely separate war plans. The Army plan is all about fighting Russia for the big land grab in Eurasia. The Navy plan has a completely different set of enemies. It'd be the United States and Britain for the big gambit. You're not going to use ships in Siberia. The big gambit for empire in the Pacific. And each of these plans, A, they're secret from the other service, and B, each plan assumes the other service is going to do all kinds of important things for them. Okay, great. So I guess the idea of secrecy and surprise, normally you apply that to your enemies, not your sister service. But that's how it works in this setup. Now, the Army does come around to the Navy plan. Why? Because they get walloped by the Russians on the Mongolian border at the Battle of Nomonhan. The Russians just decimate them in 1939. So now the Army says, okay, maybe that Southern Advance thing wasn't such a bad idea. And so the Navy thinks this is great.